late round streaming QBs. So basically, what we mean by that is when you're going into the draft, you have the mindset because quarterbacks are literally as deep as they may have ever been in the history of fantasy football. So you're going to say, you know what? I'm going to let all my buddies pick quarterbacks early, waste that value, and I'm going to wait till the eighth, ninth, 10th round, something like that, to grab a quarterback, and then maybe back him up with somebody else, and you're going to stream those guys based on matchup. So as I mentioned previously, the Cushman and I did various mock drafts using these different strategies from various positions, like beginning, middle, and end of the 12-man mocks to kind of get a feel for what these teams would look like. So Jay, why don't you go ahead and discuss kind of what you think about this strategy, how your team turned out, and if this is something you're going to want to do in future drafts.
All right. Well, first of all, let's go over the team that I drafted when I did this. I drafted LaShawn McCoy in the first round, Julius Thomas in the second, which was probably a little early, Zach Stacy in the third, Crabtree in the fourth, Edelman in the fifth, MJD in the sixth, Kendall Wright in the seventh, Cecil Shorts in the eighth. Then I went with my first quarterback in the ninth round with Jay Cutler, who I do like this year. He's got Alshon Jeffrey and Brandon Marshall to throw the ball to, not to mention a decent tight end in Martellus Bennett. So I think, as long as they can keep him off his ass in Chicago and not hurt his feelings too much so he gets butt hurt and goes and sits on the sidelines and pouts, Cutler is going to be a decent fantasy option this year. And I took Phillip Rivers in the 11th. I was actually kind of hoping to get Dalton there a little, but he didn't drop to me. So I'm okay with Phillip Rivers. Between the two of these guys throughout the season, I think I'm going to have a really good chance at having a quarterback in that is going to at least give me, a decent shot at least getting real close to somebody that, say, has a Drew Brees or a Peyton Manning. I'm not going to score that kind of points, but I'm going to score solid points enough that I'm happy with my quarterback, especially the fact that I'm getting them in the 9th and 11th rounds. I do like the running backs on this team. What is there not to like about McCoy? And I really like the fact that I got MJD in the 6th. As we all know, he's in Oakland with Darren McFadden, but we all know that DMC is going to get hurt. Week 1, walking through the tunnel, somebody will throw like a hot dog wrapper or some shit down there. He'll slip on that and bump his knee, and that'll be it for 3-4 weeks for him. So MJD is going to be the man, plain and simple, in Oakland. I think going with the tight end early is a good idea in this aspect. Like I said, I think I took him a little early, but I like having a guy at tight end. Let me rephrase that. I'm starting to come around to the idea of having a really good tight end, somebody that just blows the other competition at tight end out of the water on a weekly basis. So, as long as Crabtree pans out, you got Crabtree, you throw Edelman in there, Kendall Wright and Cecil Shorts are two guys that saved my ass last year at wide receiver. I think they're going to do it again this year, and if you can continue to get them later rounds, that's great. So I definitely always use this strategy with getting quarterbacks late. I'm not a guy that wants a stud quarterback on my team. I think you just got to take him too early. But we'll get into that later, definitely. I think this team is going to be competitive in most leagues, and I like the quarterbacks for sure. Rob, what do you think?
Yeah. You drafted out of the 2-hole in this 12-man league, so you're able to get McCoy. Zach Stacy obviously is somebody on the rise there. With MJD, somebody you don't even have to start, frankly, so that's good. Wide receivers are still good, even though you went with Julius in the 2nd, which is around early from ADP, but sometimes you just have to go after the guy you want, even if it is around early, but that's the case there. Yeah, if Crabtree should pan out, Edelman, he was a PPR legend last year, Kendall Wright, those guys, so you have really good PPR wide receiver. If this was a standard league, of course, you wouldn't have drafted these guys, but it's not. It's PPR league, so yeah, the team looks good. I was going to ask you, would you have felt you ended up getting Jay Cutler in the 9th round. Would you have felt more comfortable picking a QB 1 round early? In these kind of strategies, you're always guessing. You're looking at the other teams who's already drafted their first quarterback, is there a chance somebody might take a second before you get your first? So when you play this game of waiting, you have to be cognizant of what's going on in the draft board and when to pull the trigger. Looking back at the draft board, you could have taken, I mean, you didn't necessarily know this at the time, but you could have taken a guy like Cam Newton or Kaepernick in the 8th round, which is still waiting late on quarterbacks and still following that strategy. Would you have felt better taking Newton or Kaepernick in the 8th and maybe getting Cutler or Rivers a round or two later?
Absolutely. I've done a couple more of these drafts, and like I said, this is always my strategy. I never go after early quarterbacks. So I have been kind of going a little earlier, 7th, 8th round, grabbing a Matt Ryan and a Kaepernick. Or actually, in one draft, I did get Cam Newton and Colin Kaepernick, which that would be a fun season, is having those two guys. A couple running quarterbacks, exciting to watch. Flipping them out, every other week. It would be a fun season, but I definitely would have felt better. Like I said, I'm not disappointed in Phillip Rivers. I mean, the guy's got, he's talented enough that he's going to put points up for you, but he's kind of inconsistent sometimes, and he gives me a little indigestion thinking about having to actually play Phillip Rivers. But when you do the streaming quarterbacks, yes, you're eventually going to have to play him. Like last year I had Tony Romo and Russell Wilson, and I actually just played Romo like most of the season up until the last game when I played Dalton, that I picked up 36 points. I know you remember that. It's a painful memory for me, little shithead.
Champion.
So yeah,
yeah, it's just so our listeners know, if they've never done this strategy. First of all, I would say this. I would say, rank your quarterbacks and have a cutoff point, like because you do not need to draft two quarterbacks if you grab a stud, and your definition of a stud and mine might be different. So, you might go 6 quarterbacks deep for your quote unquote stud, or you might go 7, or you might go 4. But if you go ahead and draft a QB like maybe in the 5th or 6th, and you're able to get a Stafford that falls or something, in certain circumstances, there's no need to waste a draft pick on a second QB if you feel rock solid at the guy that you chose. This strategy is for people who wait late, and it can be frustrating at times, frankly, because you're always debating every week, which guy do I play? And there's no question that some weeks you're going to choose the wrong guy, and maybe you lose your week because of it. If you would play the other quarterback, you would have won. So it is frustrating from that perspective, but from a value perspective, it is definitely the way to go. It's the way the Cushman drafts, and it's definitely the way that I draft. And let me back this up by looking at some numbers. Let's look at last year's numbers. So last year in 12-man leagues, Breeze's ADP was the 210. Okay, so basically towards the end of the second round is when Breeze was going, and he scored 358 fantasy points, and that's at 4 points per quarterback touchdown for those following at home. On the flip side, Andrew Luck's ADP was the 8-7. So that's, the middle part of the 8th round versus the end of the second round. And he scored 292 points, which if you break that down on a per weekly basis, which I recommend our listeners do, that's only a difference of 3.8 points per week that Breeze was outscoring Andrew Luck, getting him 6 rounds later. So but the way to quantify this is you look at what are the players you could have got in Breeze's position if you, at the 210, instead of getting Breeze? You could have got guys like Demaryius Thomas, who, oh, by the way, was the number 1 wide receiver in PPR fantasy last year. You could have gotten DeMarco Murray, who, oh, by the way, stayed healthy for like 13 games and killed it. Andre Johnson caught like 100 and something balls. Those are the kind of guys you could have got instead of getting Drew Brees at the 210. And on the flip side, the best skill players you could have gotten after Andrew Luck, which again he went in the middle of the 8th round. These were guys like T.Y. Hilton, who actually had a pretty good year, but didn't nearly put up the numbers the other guys that I mentioned, and guys like DeAngelo Williams. Now, Demaryius Thomas outscored T.Y. Hilton by over 6 points a week. Okay, DeMarco Murray outscored DeAngelo by 6 points a week. So at the end of the day, would you rather have Drew Brees, T.Y. Hilton, DeAngelo Williams, or would you rather have Andrew Luck, Demaryius Thomas, DeMarco Murray type guys? I think we all would rather have the latter. So I just said that just to make the point clear that It's about, how many points per week your guys are going to score and what the value of these guys are at their positions. And the quarterbacks have never been so deep. So that was last year, but let's look at today's ADP. So those of you who are trying to figure out what strategy you want to put into this year, and if you want to wait to stream late QBs like we're advising you to do now, or if you think it might be better off to draft someone early. So today, for example, you would have to take Peyton Manning, which we'll talk about in a minute, that I actually did for purposes of this strategy in this podcast. You'd have to take him at the 202. Okay, so the beginning of the second round. And he averaged last week 25.6 points a week. Okay, but you have to remember those were career high numbers for a quarterback. That's never been done before. That will not be done by him again this year. So it'd really be more fair to look at the next quarterback in line, which was Drew Brees, and he was scoring about 22.4 points a week. Now, if you look at that and where he was going in ADP, you could get guys this season as you're drafting, guys like Julio Jones. Julio's going to average 20-something, early low 20s a week. Antonio Brown last year scored 20 points a week on average. Giovanni Bernard, from a running back perspective, scored 14 points per week on average. You can get Cam Newton in the averages 19 points a week last year, or Kaepernick that averaged 17 points in the 8th round. In the 8th round is where skilled players like Riley Cooper, Brandon Cooks, the rookie, and Fred Jackson are being drafted. So again, I ask, would you rather have Peyton Manning or Drew Brees in this regard, with Riley Cooper paired with Fred Jackson? Or would you think your team would be better off with Cam Newton and Kaepernick paired with a guy like Julio Jones, Antonio Brown, Arian Foster, or Giovanni Bernard? And again, I think we'd all pick the latter because that's what's going to be best for your team because it's the best value. And at the end of the week, you're going to score more points by waiting on quarterback, getting that value, and instead drafting the skilled players early instead of these quarterbacks early because the position is so deep.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about this a lot, you and I, and when we first started using this strategy, which was basically right after we got into fantasy football, and nothing else makes sense to me. I see guys taking Peyton Mannings and Drew Breeses and Aaron Rodgers in the first 3 rounds every year, and every year those teams, barely make the playoffs, or if they do make the playoffs, they're so weak at their other positions they end up getting just, brutally brutalized. Yes, when they make the playoffs. So it's a strategy I won't employ.
Yeah, and let's not forget, guys, too, that Peyton Manning was getting drafted like in the 5th round last year.
Yep.
He was not going in the 2nd. So the guys that took a flyer on Peyton Manning and his neck issues and so forth, yeah, they hit gold, and that was fantastic. But again, they were drafting him in like the 5th round. So that's, you're going to have to take him at the beginning of the 2nd round if you want him this year. And again, he put up historic numbers last year. And history says that he will not repeat those numbers. So don't be that guy, unless your scoring is really different or you're in a 2-quarterback league or something that changes this all together. If this is pretty much just a standard PPR league with normal scoring, even if it's 6-point touchdown scoring for quarterbacks, don't be the guy taking that, Peyton Manning in the 2nd. It's not the way to go. It's not the good value. And ultimately your team is likely going to suffer unless you just get lucky during the draft and you're drafting with a bunch of homers that don't know what they're doing.
Yep. So I say we stop beating the dead horse here because
yeah. So let's
this
change.
Is not strategy.
Yeah, we were clearly not for that. So anyway, I think that's it for our show this week. On our next show, we'll be talking about daily fantasy leagues. This is kind of where this seems to be going, and all these people are excited about these daily fantasy leagues. I know Jay dabbled in this for the first time last season. So, what are daily fantasy leagues? How do they work? How's the strategy different when you play these versus what you do on an every, week basis in redraft leagues? So we're going to kind of get into the meat and potatoes of playing daily fantasy and break that down for you. Kind of on a side note here, we'll also be giving away a free entry into a $25 league at Derby City Fantasy, or actually DerbyCityFootball.com. So DerbyCityFootball.com will be giving away a free entry into one of their $25 leagues. So keep an eye out on our Twitter account at Red Zone Warriors to find out how to win. We'll be doing some promotions here in the next couple of weeks before our next live show. So in the meantime, go to RedZoneWarriors.com where you can watch all of our previous episodes, see our rankings, and subscribe to our show via iTunes. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter and tweet us all your fantasy football questions at Red Zone Warriors. So for the Cushman, I am Rob, the Commish Smith. And remember that if you are taking a fantasy off season, then you are already losing. So thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time.